Even in a deep state of hypnosis, Barney Hill was clearly racked with terror, remembering that dark and impossible night in the White Mountains that took place almost a year before. The hypnotist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, was taking careful notes. The words Barney said shook him to his core. "Oh, those eyes, they're there in my brain. I was told to close my eyes because I saw two eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes. All I see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just up close to me, pressing against my eyes." So immersed in these traumatic memories, Barney began to scream in horror. "The eyes! The eyes!" Dr. Simon lunged forward, trying desperately to comfort Barney as the confusion and the horror washed over him anew. What had Barney seen? What event would make him and his wife Betty a part of the history of UFOs and alien abduction forever? This is the story of what many consider to be the very first reported case of alleged alien abduction. Bill Ross, a professor emeritus at UNH, even described the duo at the center of the story as the Adam and Eve of alien abduction. It all began on a dark, lonely mountain road, New Hampshire, September 19, 1961, a little after 10 p.m. It was a cold night in New Hampshire's White Mountains, where Betty and Barney Hill were cruising down Route 3 in their '57 Chevy, accompanied by their adorable dachshund, Delcy. Barney was in the driver's seat, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the music coming from the car stereo. Betty was poring over the memories of the vacation they were returning from, Montreal and Niagara Falls, the trip of a lifetime, or at least it was meant to be. In truth, the vacation that was meant to be a late honeymoon for the two had turned out to be a disaster. Betty had been frustrated by the English-French language barrier in the largely francophone area of Canada, and Barney had been gripped with a great feeling of anxious foreboding, as though something terrible was about to happen. In a sense, he was right. Their catastrophe of a vacation was soon to be overshadowed by a life-changing phenomenon waiting in the twinkling stars above. While they may have shared their first names with the characters from the Flintstones, by all accounts, Betty and Barney were a perfectly normal and well-adjusted couple. Betty was a social worker who attended the University of New Hampshire, and Barney was a veteran and an alumni of Temple University who then worked for the United States Postal Service, and both were fixtures at their local Unitarian church. The couple was a rare interracial pairing. Betty was white and Barney was black, hardly seen in rural New Hampshire in the early 60s, when miscegenation laws were still on the books in 30 different states. They were also active in the civil rights movement, both being members of the local chapter of the NAACP. Barney even sat on the board of the local United States Commission on Civil Rights. These were educated, well-respected pillars of their local community. In short, credible witnesses, hardly your stereotypical paranoid UFO cranks. But that didn't stop them from having an encounter straight out of an episode of The X-Files. It was just south of Lancaster that Betty noticed a strange light in the sky. At first she thought it must have been a shooting star, but this was the only shooting star she'd ever seen that was moving upwards. How strange, it was moving from below the moon to the west of it. Betty was no professional astronomer, but she knew this wasn't right and immediately alerted Barney to its presence. Barney had been in the U.S. Army prior to joining the Postal Service. He still kept a habit of carrying his old service pistol around with him on long trips, so he'd seen his fair share of aerial activity, but he'd never seen anything like this. The light looked to be getting bigger and brighter. Wait, was it getting closer to the car? The couple parked their car in a picnic area near Twin Mountains to give Delcy some exercise in the middle of their long car ride. While Betty walked the dog, Barney decided to satisfy his curiosity, reaching into the back of his car to find his favorite pair of binoculars. He grabbed them by their leather strap and lifted them to his eyes, and decided to take a closer look at the strange twinkling object up in the sky. It definitely wasn't a star, but it wasn't like any plane he'd seen before either. It was a disc-shaped object covered in a row of multicolored lights. Barney immediately called over to Betty, who took a look through the binoculars too. She saw the exact same unfamiliar glowing object as Barney, so either they weren't seeing things or they were both losing it. Either way, it seemed like a cause for concern. Betty immediately remembered an account her sister had given her of seeing a flying saucer a few years earlier. At the time, Betty had just humored her. She didn't believe in spacemen, but now she was beginning to entertain the idea. Barney took back the binoculars and looked again. His rational mind was working overtime to create some kind of logical explanation for this. He had a genius-level IQ of 140, so he certainly wasn't the kind of man to immediately jump to fantastical conclusions. Perhaps it was a matter of perspective. Maybe it was a passenger jet heading from Vermont to Montreal, and they were just getting a side-on view of it. That seemed reasonable enough, just a trick of angles, until he saw the object begin to lower and start moving toward them. He swallowed hard and tried to remain calm, saying, "Betty, get Delcy back in the car. It's getting late. I think we should leave." Betty had no complaints. The Hills and their dog piled back into the Chevy and took off from the picnic area across Route 3 via Franconia Notch, driving slowly to keep an eye on the strange object without attracting any undue attention from it. Betty watched the object follow them, passing across the top of a signal tower on Cannon Mountain and emerging near a series of cliff faces known as the Old Man of the Mountain due to their distinctive face-like shapes. This gave Betty enough perspective to start estimating the size of the craft. She guessed it was maybe 60 feet across, and it seemed to be rotating as though this motion powered its ability to fly. Delcy was starting to get anxious in the car, but the Hills found it impossible to get their minds off the craft as it got closer and closer, silently stalking their Chevy. No plane could get that close, no helicopter could be that quiet. The curiosity was too great now. Barney decided to stop the car and get a closer look, having no idea that this seemingly innocent decision would lead to the worst night of his life. He slammed on the brakes in the middle of the quiet highway a mile south of Indian Head and stepped out, sliding his pistol out of his pocket and aiming his binoculars at the rapidly descending object. What he saw struck him with mortal terror. The craft had illuminated windows, and behind them, 8 to 11 strange humanoid beings stood watching him. They were wearing glossy black uniforms and military-style caps. His jaw dropped. This was impossible. While Betty was desperately asking her husband what he was seeing, the beings, which were definitely not human, scattered inside the craft to a large control console. Only one, possibly the leader, remained at the window, holding Barney's gaze. He felt strange electrical sensations fizzling all through his body as a voice spoke directly into his mind. "Stay where you are and keep looking," it said. Barney could barely move. Barney began to panic, screaming, "We need to get out of here! They're going to capture us!" to his wife as the craft descended, releasing fin-like protrusions from its sides. The two were able to break free of the strange psychic control that the telepathic beings were exerting over them and scrambled back to their car. They floored it, driving as fast as they could in the direction of their hometown of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And they would arrive there, just not the way they expected. The last thing that either of them remembered after that was hearing some strange beeping noises, like the kind that happened when you pressed buttons on a microwave, emanating from the trunk of their car. Their bodies began to tingle, and what seemed like a huge fiery orb blocked their route. Within the space of a blink, it was over, and they regained lucidity, 35 miles south of Franconia Notch. They had somehow moved in the wrong direction and lost track of 2 hours of time in the process. Their dog Delcy was hiding under one of the seats. The couple had 1,000 questions, but they all fit neatly under one. What the hell had happened? Their first priority was getting out of the mountains and returning home, which they were finally able to do by dawn, feeling tired, confused, and disoriented. But sadly for the Hills, their anomalous experience wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As in the hours and days following the incident, they began to notice increasingly strange things, clues that might have held answers to the mysterious events that happened the night before. Both of their watches were broken and never worked again after that night, as though some force had interfered with the mechanisms. The strap of Barney's binoculars was also now broken, as though somebody had yanked them off of his body during a struggle. Betty's dress was also stained and torn, further suggesting that the couple had indeed been involved in some kind of altercation. There were also strange scuffs on Barney's shoes and shiny circles on the back of the car that hadn't been there before. More peculiar still, when the couple held a compass next to the shiny circles, it went haywire, indicating that they had somehow been magnetized, though for reasons neither member of the couple could really understand. But it wasn't just the objects. There were changes to the bodies and the minds of Betty and Barney Hill. Betty, for reasons unknown to her, felt the need to pack the luggage they'd brought back at the back of the house rather than inside it, perhaps as a subconscious acknowledgement of the fear that their possessions had somehow been contaminated by the experience. This was doubly true for her ruined dress, which she later noticed was covered in a strange pink powder that she was unable to identify. The effects on Barney would be even more pronounced. He experienced severe soreness of the back and neck, and the strangest sense that somehow semen had been harvested from him. He compulsively checked his family jewels in the bathroom, but thankfully found that there was nothing amiss. The couple took long showers just in case they were irradiated or contaminated, and when they tried to recall the chronology of the events that took place after they tried to escape from the beings on the flying saucer, their memories failed them. It was like they'd been deleted from the minds of Betty and Barney Hill. Someone or something didn't want them to know what had happened that night. In this time of uncertainty, Barney wanted to return to something familiar, the military. Their first port of call was to report what they'd seen to the Air Force, speaking to an officer at the local Portsmouth Air Force Base. However, they omitted certain details from their report, worrying that they'd be just thought of as insane. While the officer they spoke to told them that they had most likely just seen Jupiter and mistook it for a craft, he still reported their story to the infamous Project Blue Book, which any ardent UFO fans in our audience will be intimately familiar with. Project Blue Book was the long-running Pentagon UFO research project running from 1947 through 1969 and cataloging 12,618 sightings in that time. However, the project didn't look kindly on the Hill incident, filing it under insufficient data. Next came the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP. The couple spoke for 6 hours to Boston-based astronomer Walter N. Webb, who was also a member of NICAP. While the couple still couldn't recall what happened during the period of lost time, they were able to give a comprehensive account of everything else. Webb would later respond, "They were telling the truth, and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations where human judgment is involved." But this wasn't the end. In fact, the strangest parts of the story were yet to reveal themselves. Around 10 days after the encounter, when Barney was eager to put the whole incident behind them and forget it happened, Betty began having strange, vivid dreams. Dreams that she believed may have been related to their encounter on that fateful September night. These dreams occurred for 5 straight days, seemingly building in detail and intensity each time, more like memories than products of the imagination. Betty felt compelled to write down the dreams, and certain interesting little details started to accumulate. One dream seemed to be almost a continuation of the time that they lost in the night of the abduction. Betty was stopped with her husband at the roadblock in their '56 Chevy when strange men surrounded their car. At this point in the dream, she lost consciousness. When she awoke, 2 small men were forcing her to walk through a forest, and when she turned, she saw Barney walking through the forest, trance-like, behind her. This was the first time post-incident that either of them were able to recall what their extraterrestrial captors looked like. They ranged from 5 feet to around 5 feet 4 inches tall, with grayish skin, dark eyes, black hair, bluish lips, and prominent noses. They wore similar military garbs that Barney could recall seeing when he first stared at the craft through his binoculars, matching uniforms with caps like those of a military cadet. In the dream, after being marched through the forest, the aliens took Betty and Barney back to their car. The leader of the aliens told them to watch the craft take off, which they did, at which point the couple started driving home as though nothing strange had happened at all. Could this have been a fragment of what happened that night? And if it was, what happened before they were marched back to their car? Another dream held potential answers. Betty recalled being led into the metallic craft, along with Barney, where they underwent unethical experimentation from the aliens, directed by 2 main figures which she identified as the leader and the examiner. While the leader directed them all, the examiner bound Betty to a table and injected her in the navel with an unknown substance. This caused her a moment of excruciating pain before quickly dissipating after some more telepathic encouragement from the leader. Many people refer to the Betty and Barney Hill abduction as the first alien abduction because it defined so many of the recurring traits we would see manifest in later accounts of alien abductions and their aftermaths. One of these is the common concept of missing time, experienced by the Hills when they suddenly regained awareness far from their intended locations, having lost track of 2 hours. In more fanciful cases, such as the Hills, this missing time is often seen as the result of alien memory manipulation technology. And in more mundane cases, memory loss is theorized to be the result of traumatic repression. And one thing can be said for certain. For Barney and Betty, this incident was definitely traumatic. Betty's nightmares were often extremely distressing, and Barney, while he showed fewer outward signs of distress, was experiencing ever-worsening anxiety over the incident. Soon enough, they turned to a psychiatrist and neurologist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, for help, a man who also happened to be a professional therapeutic hypnotist. The deal was struck. Over a series of sessions, Dr. Simon would help them excavate the memories of what happened that night. but nobody was ready for just how strange and disturbing some of these sessions would be. Betty and Barney were given their sessions separately in order to make sure they couldn't influence one another. Certain details seemed oddly consistent across both their accounts. The two of them were stopped in the road for some kind of blockade when the strange aliens surrounded them and took them out of the car, at which point they were both led up a metal ramp into the spacecraft that had been stalking them. Once on the craft, the two were separated and taken into different experimentation rooms with curved walls and metal tables in the center. They were each asked to climb onto the tables, at which point a battery of tests began, involving taking scrapings of their skin, clipping their fingernails, and taking a large number of samples with needles. After Betty's examination was complete, the aliens started asking her questions about her husband. They seemed particularly fascinated by the fact that Barney's teeth could come out, leading Betty to explain the apparently foreign concept of dentures to the beings. While Barney was undergoing significantly more traumatic tests, including probable semen extraction, Betty continued to converse with the leader. She asked him where the craft had flown from, and the leader jokes, "If you don't know where you are, there wouldn't be any point in telling you where I am." Despite this, the leader did show Betty a star map, which she was able to recreate under Dr. Simon's hypnosis. The map would be documented in the 1966 John G. Fuller book, The Interrupted Journey, along with the effects that the hypnosis had on Barney. While Betty seemed to have had a positively cordial relationship with the leader, Barney's hypnosis sessions often devolved into incoherent yelling, screaming, and crying, all of which Dr. Simon recorded in their extensive sessions. Dr. Simon, for the record, never said that he believed the couple was lying, even if he doubted the actual facts of the matter. He never doubted that the Hills truly believed what they were telling him, describing it as a singular psychological aberration. While the story of Betty and Barney Hill's abduction did end up circulating through the media machine, especially among local communities, the Hills together didn't actively seek out publicity. They were forthcoming with their information when asked, but neither seemed particularly motivated by the fame their case had given them. In 1968, 2 years after The Journey Interrupted was published, elementary school teacher and hobbyist astronomer Marjorie Fish would revisit the star map that Betty drew under hypnosis. Assuming one of the data points was Earth's sun, she determined that the aliens came from the Zeta Reticuli star system. This is the reason why the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case is also sometimes known as the Zeta Reticuli incident. However, Fish's research on this was highly contentious, drawing support from some, such as the aforementioned NICAP member Walter N. Webb, while drawing heavy criticism from others. Perhaps the most famous of these critics was celebrity astronomer Carl Sagan, who even took the time to debunk the Zeta Reticuli theory in his iconic TV show Cosmos. When it came to the Betty and Barney Hill case, it seemed difficult to find a true consensus on anything. Tragically, Barney would die young, passing away from a stroke at age 46 on February 25, 1969. It's not impossible that the stress and anxiety that defined his years after the incident, which caused Barney to develop painful ulcers, may have also raised his blood pressure and increased his chances of suffering an intracerebral hemorrhage. This left Betty to share their story with the public alone, though things were never quite the same for Betty after Barney passed away. In her later years, Betty seemed to fall victim to age-related cognitive decline. Prominent UFO skeptic Robert Schaefer in the Skeptical Inquirer magazine illustrated this in the following sad anecdotes. I was present at the National UFO Conference in New York City in 1980, at which Betty presented some of the UFO photos she had taken. She showed what must have been far more than 200 slides, mostly of blips, blurs, and blobs against a dark background. These were supposed to be UFOs coming in close, chasing her car, landing, etc. After her talk had exceeded about twice its allotted time, Betty was literally jeered off the stage by what had been at first a sympathetic audience. This incident, witnessed by many of ufology's leaders and top activists, removed any lingering doubts about Betty's credibility. She had none. In 1995, Betty Hill wrote a self-published book, A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. It's filled with delusional stories, such as seeing entire squadrons of UFOs in flight and a truck levitating above the freeway. After the shocking death of Barney, Betty felt increasingly isolated in the last few decades of her life, as mainstream institutions increasingly treated her and her experience as a kind of fringe case. This resulted in her seeking understanding and community among less and less credible conspiracy theorists and UFO believers, who also dipped their toes in phenomena like Bigfoot, black helicopter conspiracy theories, and cattle mutilation. Even other UFO enthusiasts were starting to note Betty's sadly degrading relationship with reality. She went for an evening of UFO spotting with ufologist John Oswald, who later said of the event, quote, "She is not really seeing UFOs, but she is calling them that." Mrs. Hill was unable to distinguish between a landed UFO and a streetlight. Regardless of the truth of the original encounter, few were inclined to believe a word out of Betty's mouth in the 1990s and beyond. She never moved on from Barney, the love of her life, and never remarried. She would eventually pass away from cancer in 2004, leaving little more than the legacy of an event that may or may not have happened decades before. So we've heard from the people who truly believe that Barney and Betty Hill's abduction happened. But what about the other camp? There have been a number of interesting skeptic perspectives on the Betty and Barney Hill incident, critiquing it from different angles. One of those came from one of the Hills' neighbors, fantasy and science fiction author James D. McDonald. After analyzing the accounts provided by Betty, he claimed that her description of the craft's movements over Cannon Mountain perfectly matched a driver's perception of an aircraft warning beacon situated nearby. As for the more colorful parts of the account, McDonald suggests that sleep deprivation from the long trip, general stress, and false memories recalled under hypnosis could adequately explain everything that happened. Another strange wrinkle in the case involves a classic science fiction anthology TV show called The Outer Limits. Several episodes of that show feature entities and scenarios that feel eerily similar to some of the things Barney and Betty Hill recalled during their hypnosis session, leading some critics such as Martin S. Kottmeyer to suggest that Barney may have unknowingly mixed up memories of watching the TV show with his own memories under hypnosis, and in some cases the evidence is pretty damning. In one episode titled The Bolero Shield, an alien creature was featured with eyes that seemed to strikingly resemble the ones that Barney drew under hypnosis. In another episode titled The Invisibles, humans fall victim to a species of alien parasites through a surgical procedure that is eerily similar to the probing described by Barney in his hypnotic state, which could have influenced his telling of the events if he'd seen it. But the most similar of all is an episode entitled The Children of Spider County, where 4 men are kidnapped by another alien, which again bore a striking resemblance to the one that Barney described and sketched. The similarities to the episode don't even stop with the design of the creature. It's a major plot point in the episode that the characters, who all belong to outcast groups, are ambushed by the aliens while in their car, which crashes as a result of the incident. Skeptics suggest that it's more than possible that Barney could have seen any of these episodes, which were released in the month before one of his hypnotic testimonies, and had his recollections influenced by what he'd seen. Though for whatever it's worth, Betty Hill claimed that the couple had never watched an episode of The Outer Limits, so the faint possibility exists that it was pure coincidence. Others have sought to find some sort of psychological consensus for the alien abduction phenomenon. Richard J. McNally, a Harvard psychologist, said, "The alien abduction phenomenon, in my opinion, shows how sincere, non-psychotic individuals can develop beliefs about and false memories of incredible experiences that never happened." One explanation for how this could work comes from Christopher French, a psychologist specializing in human experience related to the paranormal, who said, "What we see and hear, especially under less than ideal observational conditions, can be heavily influenced by our prior beliefs and expectations. This phenomenon seems consistent with how Betty and Barney subjectively experienced their supposed encounters. Betty, who was open-minded and excited by the concept of meeting aliens, had an overall more pleasant experience with said aliens. Her prior biases informed her present experience, even down to being able to understand and extensively converse with the aliens. Barney, on the other hand, was a World War II veteran who was also rendered far more cautious by his history of experiencing racism as a black man in 1960s America. He had difficulty understanding the aliens and even said that the leader reminded him of Adolf Hitler, a far cry from the friendly interstellar conversationalist that Betty had met. Memory is highly fallible and can easily be affected by a huge number of factors that may have been working against the Hills on the night when they believed they encountered an alien race in the White Mountains. Some of the more modern analyses of the event, while still casting a sympathetic light on the Hills, suggest that the abduction could have been a kind of shared psychological fantasy that reflected the couple's subconscious feelings about race in America. As one of the aforementioned rare interracial couples of the era, as well as active civil rights activists and advocates in 1961, it's fair to say that the couple likely experienced their fair share of racism, particularly Barney, who also seemed the most traumatized by the event. In his book, The Abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, Alien Encounters, Civil Rights, and the New Age in America, historian and author Matthew Bowman states, "When Barney is hypnotized and recovers all these memories, the language he uses is really colored by fear of racial persecution. In the hours of hypnosis footage taken by Dr. Simon, it's undeniable that Barney was on edge with the fears of racial persecution in Canada, playing into his already anxious disposition. Just as MacDonald had hinted at decades earlier, Barney's stress and anxiety around the events of the trip, also felt by his wife, may have colored his perception of the events. In this reading, the encounter seems to be a kind of shared, stress-induced mental breakdown, which left the couple with a host of traumatic false memories. Bowman isn't alone in this assessment. Christopher Bader, a professor of sociology at California's Chapman University, said of the incident, quote, "You have a biracial couple at a time where obviously it was not easy to be a biracial couple. Look what those aliens were, a mixture of black and white. I find that very meaningful. Studies have shown that chronic anxiety can make people more susceptible to hallucinations. So there is some scientific basis for suggesting that the continued stress of being a politically active interracial couple in 1960s America, fused with the stress and sleep deprivation of a long drive and a late night, could have resulted in a 2-hour split from reality. Though of course this would do little to explain certain physical effects, like the shiny marks on the back of the car. One thing that can be said about the Betty and Barney Hill case is that it had a powerful impact on culture. From movies and TV shows to the field of ufology itself, the incident inspired the 1975 TV movie The UFO Incident, which may have had an incredibly uncreative name, but featured Darth Vader himself, James Earl Jones, as Barney Hill. It was also a pivotal piece of inspiration behind alien-focused TV shows like Dark Skies and, of course, The X-Files, which is credited with restarting the alien craze in the 90s. In a strange and funny coincidence, the UFO incident may have paid the UFO craze forward in the real world too. Not long after the movie aired on television, a 22-year-old logger named Travis Walton claimed to have been abducted by aliens for 5 days, a claim that he soon spun into not only successful media appearances, but its own movie adaptation, 1993's Fire in the Sky. The Travis Walton abduction incident, unlike that of the Hills, is widely accepted to be a hoax perpetrated by Walton and his co-conspirators for personal gain. It's hard to even say where we'd be without that incident in the White Mountains. But what is the truth of the iconic Betty and Barney Hill case? The first true alien abduction, or just another fabrication spun from one strange and inexplicable night? Now check out Soviet Union declassified UFO encounters revealed, or watch this instead.